October 2019. Under the vast open skies of North Dakota, a quiet disaster was unfolding, hidden from sight, seeping into the very earth. A rupture, a tear in the steel artery known as the Keystone Pipeline, had begun to bleed. Not blood, but something far more insidious for the delicate ecosystem it traversed: crude oil. This wasn't a trickle, this was a torrent. Before it was detected, before the alarms were raised, an estimated 383,000 gallons of toxic tar sands oil had gushed out, contaminating a sprawling area of precious wetlands near the small community of Edinburgh. The landscape, a vital habitat for migratory birds and other wildlife, was now stained black, suffocating under a thick, viscous blanket of industrial waste. The scale of the spill was staggering, covering an area equivalent to nearly 6 football fields. State environmental scientist Carl Rockeman described the scene with grim clarity, noting the oil had impacted a wetland and was now being contained. But containment is only the first desperate step in a long and arduous battle against an environmental catastrophe. The images that emerged were stark and deeply unsettling. Specialized crews in hazmat suits wading through the blackened marsh, skimming oil from the water's surface, digging up contaminated soil by the truckload. The air, once clean and crisp, was heavy with the pungent chemical odor of petroleum. For the local community and environmental advocates, it was a nightmare realized, a potent symbol of the risks they had long warned about. This wasn't just an accident. For many, it felt like an inevitability. The Keystone Pipeline system, operated by the Canadian company TC Energy, formerly TransCanada, had been a flashpoint of controversy for years. Environmental groups, indigenous communities, and landowners had fought tooth and nail against its construction and expansion, citing the inherent dangers of transporting diluted bitumen, a heavy, corrosive form of crude oil, across sensitive aquifers and ecosystems. They had pointed to the company's track record, arguing that it wasn't a matter of if a spill would happen, but when and where. The 2019 leak in North Dakota was a devastating validation of those fears, a stark and oily testament to the potential consequences of prioritizing fossil fuel infrastructure over environmental protection. The disaster renewed and amplified the urgent calls for a fundamental reevaluation of the nation's energy policies, questioning the wisdom of relying on a system that carried such a high and often hidden price. The response to the 2019 North Dakota spill was a massive multi-agency effort, a race against time to mitigate the spreading damage. TC Energy, the pipeline's operator, immediately deployed hundreds of workers to the site. The scene was a hive of industrial activity set against a backdrop of natural devastation. Vacuum trucks, their engines a constant drone, worked tirelessly to suck up the pooled oil from the water's surface. Excavators clawed at the earth, removing tons of contaminated soil, which was then loaded onto trucks and hauled away for disposal. Inflatable booms, bright yellow and orange barriers, were strategically placed to try and corral the slick, preventing it from spreading further into the delicate wetland ecosystem. Federal regulators from the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, were on the ground, overseeing the cleanup and launching an investigation into the cause of the breach. Despite the scale of the mobilization, the challenges were immense. Crude oil, especially the heavy tar sands variety transported by Keystone, is notoriously difficult to clean up. It doesn't just float, it sinks, mixing with sediment and permeating the soil, creating a toxic sludge that can persist for decades. The cleanup process is painstakingly slow and incredibly expensive. TC Energy estimated the initial costs would run into the tens of millions of dollars, a figure that often climbs as the long-term environmental impacts become clearer. For the delicate ecosystem, the damage was immediate and severe. The oil chokes plant life, poisons the water, and poses a lethal threat to the fish, birds, and mammals that depend on the wetlands for survival. The invisible toll, the disruption of the food chain, the long-term contamination of the soil and groundwater, is a wound that heals far more slowly than the visible scars on the landscape. This disaster was not an isolated incident for the Keystone system. In fact, it was the second major spill in just 2 years, a fact that deeply alarmed critics and regulators alike. In November 2017, another section of the same pipeline ruptured in rural South Dakota, releasing what was ultimately estimated to be over 400,000 gallons of crude oil onto agricultural land. The similarities between the two events were chilling. Both involved significant breaches on a relatively new pipeline, and both occurred in remote rural areas, highlighting the difficulty of rapid detection and response. The recurring failures raised serious questions about the integrity of the pipeline's construction, the materials used, and the effectiveness of TC Energy's safety and monitoring protocols. Following the 2017 spill, the company had assured the public and regulators that it was taking steps to enhance safety. Yet, 2 years later, another massive leak occurred. For opponents of the pipeline, this pattern demonstrated a fundamental flaw in the system, proving that the risks were not hypothetical but dangerously real and recurring. The repeated failures fueled a powerful narrative of corporate negligence and regulatory inadequacy, strengthening the resolve of those fighting to halt the construction of its controversial and much larger sibling project, the Keystone XL. The 2019 North Dakota spill immediately poured fuel on the already raging fire of debate surrounding the Keystone XL pipeline, a proposed expansion that would have dramatically increased the flow of Canadian tar sands oil to U.S. refineries. For years, the project had been a political lightning rod, symbolizing the deep national divide over climate change, energy independence, and environmental justice. Proponents, including industry groups and some political leaders, touted Keystone XL as a source of jobs and a step toward reducing reliance on oil from less stable regions. They argued that pipelines were the safest way to transport crude oil, far superior to rail or truck. However, the leak in North Dakota provided a visceral, powerful counter-argument. Opponents seized upon the images of the blackened wetlands as undeniable proof of the inherent dangers. How could anyone claim pipelines were safe when the existing system had just failed so spectacularly for the second time in 2 years? Indigenous leaders, whose ancestral lands and water sources lay directly in the path of the proposed XL route, pointed to the spill as a terrifying preview of what could happen to their communities. Environmental organizations used the disaster to highlight the specific risks of transporting diluted bitumen, which they argued was more corrosive and harder to clean up than conventional crude. The spill became a central talking point in lawsuits and protests aimed at blocking the XL project's permits. It shifted the debate from abstract risk assessment to tangible, devastating reality. The question was no longer just about economic benefits versus potential environmental harm. It was about the demonstrated failure of the existing infrastructure and the credibility of the company behind it. The 383,000 gallons of oil seeping into the North Dakota earth became a potent symbol of a promise broken and a risk made real, fundamentally altering the political landscape for Keystone XL and invigorating the movement against it. In the aftermath of the spill, the official investigation sought to pinpoint the exact cause of the failure. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration issued a corrective action order, forcing TC Energy to keep the affected section of the pipeline shut down until a thorough analysis was completed and repairs were approved. The investigation eventually pointed to manufacturing defects in the steel pipe and potential issues with the pipeline's construction. This finding was particularly damning, as it suggested that the problem wasn't simply a matter of wear and tear on an old pipeline. This was a relatively new piece of infrastructure, only in operation since 2010. The implications were profound, suggesting that flaws may have been built into the system from the very beginning. For TC Energy, the financial and reputational costs were significant. The cleanup itself was a monumental and expensive undertaking, projected to cost millions. Beyond the immediate financial outlay, the company faced intense scrutiny from both US and Canadian regulators, as well as a fresh wave of public outrage and legal challenges. The spills in both South and North Dakota severely damaged the company's credibility and its core argument that it could operate its pipelines safely. This damage rippled out, directly impacting the political viability of the Keystone XL project. The repeated failures provided ammunition for opponents and made it increasingly difficult for political supporters to defend the project. The narrative of safest-in-class technology was shattered by the reality of hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil contaminating American soil. The long-term consequences included not just the ecological recovery of the affected wetlands, which could take generations, but also a deeper, more profound erosion of public trust in the fossil fuel industry and the regulatory bodies meant to oversee it. The black stain on the North Dakota landscape was a stark reminder that the true cost of our energy infrastructure is often paid by the environment and the communities left to deal with the aftermath.